99% of all animal life on the planet is smaller than a human finger. So it's safe to say that Peter sweats the small stuff. He documents the smaller minority that this miniature world represents. So tonight he'll take us on an expedition into the land of the unexpected, a fascinating world where the monkeys and giraffes and tigers and lions are likely to be grasshoppers and weevils and beetles and ants. They're little known, overlooked, ill-considered, yet they are in many ways the glue that holds this planet together. And in the realm of biodiversity, it's where big things are done by the small ones, an ecosystem where size really does matter. Peter's amassed an extraordinary body of work representing a lifetime commitment to conservation, and I'm honored to welcome him to the stage tonight. Please welcome him.
Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I hope you all like spiders and insects. And if you don't, hopefully, by the end, when I'm done, you will have at least some appreciation for these smaller organisms. Just about a week ago, I was in this place. It's a place called Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, in East Africa. And what I do there is several things. First of all, we are trying to rebuild this park. This park was almost completely destroyed during a 20-year-long civil war in Mozambique. It lost almost all of its animal life, and we are bringing it back. But I'm also trying to understand what else is there other than the big, charismatic megafauna, the elephants, the lions, and such. And so I was there trying to document what lives in this place, which is called the Bunga Inselbergs. And if you were following the festival's Instagram account, you might have noticed pictures of insects and other small things popping up on it. And if you didn't appreciate it then perhaps the fact that every time I wanted to send a picture, I had to climb that mountain because that was the only place where I could get a cell signal, maybe that will make you appreciate it a little more. On the last day of my stay in Mozambique, I took a drive to the central floodplain to have my last beer at the sunset, and I took this photo. And when you look at this photo, what you obviously will see is these gorgeous animals, the antelopes known as water bucks. If you look a little closer, you may notice a couple of egrets. And if you are a photographer, you will probably also notice those annoying specks in the frame. And you will probably be kind of itching to clone them out in Photoshop. But to me, those specks actually represent the most important element of that photo because they, to me, complete the picture of biodiversity of the park. Those specks are, of course, flying insects. And that's what I'll be mostly talking about tonight. Why we care about them, why we should care about them, what I do towards convincing people that they are worthy of our attention and protection. By training, I'm an entomologist, so that's why I was instantly drawn to these animals. I am also a conservation biologist, and I'm also a part-time photographer. And I've always had this feeling that we nature photographers are doing a pretty lousy job trying to convince the general public that we should care about the smaller things. And I've decided to embark on a quest to change it. Nature photography can be roughly divided into two categories. The photography of the place, which tries to convey the nature of a site, make you care about it by showing people these evocative images of various exotic locations. And they work great. If we want to create a national park, this type of imagery works great. But if you want to make people care, really care about organisms, you have to show them the organismal photography. You have to show things that people can relate on a one-to-one basis. And that's why this animal works so great, because you can look into its eyes. And that's why this animal has become the icon of nature conservation. But that puts a lot of other organisms at a great disadvantage because we humans are visual animals and we relate to other organisms through our eyes and their eyes. Then if you don't have eyes, that puts you at a great disadvantage. This is a subterranean lizard that is far more highly endangered than the giant panda. It lives only in one site in East Africa. There's a tiny little population, critically endangered. How do I make you care about it? Nature photographers who care about smaller things are also at a disadvantage in the sense that we cannot use certain types of images. When I show you this, everybody will be, ooh, the majestic leopard eating its prey. But if I show you this, it's exactly the same behavior. And, you don't have the same, elated reaction to it. Even though it's exactly the same behavior. And I would venture to say that the solpugid or the sun scorpion is a much more interesting predator than the leopard. It's also difficult for people who care about smaller things to use the imagery that relates to, let's say, reproduction. Everybody loves, courting birds and birds doing things like nuzzling and such. But if I show you exactly the same behavior in slugs, I probably won't get the same reaction. It is disadvantageous. I also cannot appeal to your sense of outrage. In the national park where I work, we deal with the tremendous problem of poaching. And my heart bleeds when I see this beautiful sable antelope killed for meat. And, obviously we should do something about it, and we use this type of imagery. But I cannot use the same type of an image to appeal to your sense of outrage about this endemic fly. So we are somewhat limited in our toolbox that we can use as nature photographers to convey the message of conservation of smaller organisms. And yet, they really need our help. This lizard is called Smog mozambicus, like the smog from the Lord of the Ring. This lizard and this grasshopper and this pygmy chameleon, this is a mother with a baby, they all live in this beautiful rainforest on Mount Gorongosa, which is the southernmost and the last remaining patch of this ancient Congolese rainforest that used to stretch from Cairo to Cape Town, let's say from present-day Egypt to present-day South Africa, about 10 million years ago. Anyway, we have this last remaining patch, and that's where these organisms live, or at least used to live. This is this forest about 2 years ago, and this is this forest now. We are losing it at an alarming rate, at the rate of about 15% per year. The situation is absolutely critical. But the only thing that I can show you to convince you that this place is worth saving are these small organisms. There are no lions or elephants on the mountain, but that doesn't mean that that mountain is not important. Here's another example. This is a frog. This frog doesn't even have a name yet. It was only recently discovered in the rainforest of Papua New Guinea. This is a male, and he's guarding his eggs. It's just a beautiful little animal living in this, what I consider the most beautiful rainforest in the world, the high elevation rainforest in Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, just a few miles from where I took that picture, I also took this picture. Massive scale mining is moving in and threatening this entire ecosystem. Here's another example, unfortunately also pretty sad. A few years ago, I was in South Africa, and I stopped at this little patch of a native yellowwood forest. It's a beautiful little type of vegetation endemic to that part of the world. And I found there this little katydid Katydids are my specialty. So when I saw it, I immediately recognized it as something new to science. So I collected it and I described it in a scientific journal, and I gave it the name Paraselacris periclitatus, which translates into the endangered katydid. The reason I called it that is because that patch of the native yellow wood forest was completely surrounded by a massive pine and eucalyptus plantation. And now when I checked recently satellite photos from that site, that forest is gone, which probably means that this species is already extinct. Here's another highly endangered animal that I discovered. Luckily, this one I found within the boundaries of a protected area of a nature reserve, so at least its execution has been postponed. Here's a freshwater crab. This one is, it's a yet unnamed species that, as far as we know, is restricted to one river system, and in this case, this animal is threatened by invasive crayfish that actually came from North America and are invading South African waters. So these things are really teetering on the brink of extinction, or have already tipped to the other side. But why should we care? Why does it matter if a katydid or a crab goes extinct? Well, it's a tough question, actually, and even I struggle with it. Well, there are many reasons. The most obvious, or the ones that are most frequently presented, are the utilitarian reasons. We should care because our life depends on those organisms. They provide a number of so-called ecosystem services on which we depend in our day-to-day life. I mean, probably at least a third of the food that you ate today was on your plate thanks to the services provided by insects, mostly pollination services, services provided by moths, and flies, and bees, and so on. But that's just part of the story. Pollination is important, but they do so many other things that we don't know about. Invertebrates are sort of like the plumber. How often do you think about your plumber? Only when your toilet overflows. But then it becomes critically important that he comes right away. Now, insects and other invertebrates provide those types of services. They create the soil, they aerate the soil, they filter the water, they remove dead organisms. The reason why the streets of our cities are not littered with dead pigeons and rats is because ants take care of that. There was a study recently done in New York City that demonstrated that any piece of food that drops on the sidewalk is removed by ants within the next 30 minutes. 30 minutes and it's gone. And we don't even know about it. So ecosystem services are a good reason enough to really care about these organisms and make sure that they are doing okay. But there are others. Invertebrates help us in a far more direct way. I'm sure that there are people in this audience, unfortunately, who suffer from heart diseases. This animal, the scorpion, has probably saved a lot of your lives. One of the common heart problems is arrhythmia. And one of the most powerful drugs that treats arrhythmia is something based on one of the peptides found in a stinger of a scorpion. It's a peptide called ardescretin. And it directly affects the heart muscle and allows us to fight arrhythmia. Scorpions possibly will help us in one other way. Some of you may know that if you expose a scorpion to a certain type of light, if you expose it to ultraviolet light, they begin to glow. And the reason for that is that their bodies are covered with a substance called fluorescent beta-carboline. And beta carbolines are interesting from a chemical point of view because they age. As they get older, their physical properties change. In the case of scorpions, as their carbolines get older, they become to glow in ultraviolet light. Now, we humans also have beta carbolines in our bodies. They're in our eyeballs. And as they get older, unfortunately, they don't start glowing, they become opaque. And that's why we develop the cataracts. So now, a group of scientists in Germany are working on trying to understand the chemistry and physics of oxidative aging of beta carbolines with the hope of understanding it and finding a way of reversing it, and in the process, finding a cure for the cataracts. So you find this help in the most unexpected places. But the real champion that helps save people's lives is, of course, the majestic Atlantic horseshoe crab. That animal probably has saved more human lives than any other organisms on the planet. I can assure you that many people in this audience have been saved by these animals. In the 1950s, a gentleman named Frederick Bang realized that the blood of horseshoe crabs is extremely sensitive to a certain type of bacteria. And he developed a compound called Limulus amoebocyte lysate that has become the standard compound for detection of bacterial contamination in medical instruments, body fluids, and any kind of medicine that goes on the market. So if you've ever had a surgery or given an injection or took a drug, the sterility of those was tested with the blood of horseshoe crabs. So that's a good reason to care. So we have all these utilitarian reasons, but I actually personally don't like using them because that introduces some kind of a system of ranking, that this one animal is more important than the other because it saves us. And I don't think this is the right reason to protect and help those animals. I think that the main reason is a moral one. It's a moral obligation to leave this planet to the future generations the way we found it. I want our kids, our grandkids, and their grandkids to be able to make their own decision whether they like or don't like spiders. And every single organism has exactly the same right to live as we do. So how do we go about selling that message? How do we build this respect and care for these smaller organisms? Well, we have to start early. I'm sure that there are people here who don't like spiders very much, and you can probably trace that dislike or fear to some moment in time in your childhood. Something traumatic happened and that triggered that fear. Unfortunately, it's our own nature, our own genes that work against us because there's evidence that the fear of spiders, just like the fear of snakes, is genetically based. We have a built-in predisposition to be afraid of them. And that makes perfect sense because when we were evolving in the savannas of East Africa 2 or 3 million years ago, it made perfect sense to be afraid of every single one of the spiders that you see, just in case one of them could be deadly. And just to be clear, most spiders are completely harmless, absolutely harmless, and most of them are beautiful, they are important, and many of them are also highly threatened. I mean, how can you not like something like this? I mean, they're just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, to me, some of these spiders look like jewelry. I mean, somebody should make jewelry like this. I mean, seriously. So when I talk about spiders, I always talk about them in a very positive way. And that, believe it or not, can backfire. So I run a little blog called thesmallermajority.com. And a while ago, I posted a story about a spider that I found in South America. It was this spider, the Goliath spider. It's the largest spider in the world, and I described it in a very positive way, what a fantastic animal that was. And then I admitted that the spider was collected for a museum collection. And that started a global outrage. My tiny little blog that normally receives probably no more than 300, 400 visits every day started getting about 200,000 visits a day, and negative comments were pouring by the thousands. I literally received death threats for killing that spider, which is never done lightly, by the way, but it's a part of the process of understanding and documenting biodiversity. But anyway, all that I take as a very positive development. If I can make people care enough to kill me about a single spider, then there is a chance. Then we have a chance to convince people that they should care about these smaller elements of our global life. Now, one of the obstacles when talking about these types of things is that they are small. People do not relate very well to small things, which I, as a short person, take as a very deeply personal offense. But in fact, just think about it. I mean, what are these things? They're just some like gray little blobs. If you were a giant, how different are these animals from these animals? I mean, it's all the matter of perspective and being willing to get down to their level and trying to truly understand them. So, as a photographer, I'm trying to show these smaller organisms in the most flattering and beautiful way. So I often use this kind of a very common studio technique when I remove any elements that you can use to compare this subject to. That kind of forces you as a viewer to appreciate the animal for what it is, for its inherent beauty and complexity. I mean, these are just common moths that came to my light in Costa Rica, where I also do some work. They're just absolutely stunning animals. And by placing them on the white background, I'm forcing you to focus exclusively on this animal. Very, very powerful technique. I can even make you appreciate this animal. Isn't it cute? Super cute, right? That's a parasite that came out of my arm. It's a botfly that I get infected with when I was working in Belize, and I brought it home and I raised my little maggot, and then I let it hatch, and then it turned into this beautiful, beautiful fly. But I mean, quite honestly, isn't it a pretty animal? So this technique is very, very powerful in forcing the viewer to appreciate the animals for what they are. And one thing that happens here, because you don't have any point of reference, you never know how big this animal is. I mean, some of these things are truly microscopic, but that doesn't matter. This, by the way, is the mother and her baby, and she immediately ate the baby. Some of these portraits I take in the natural environment, of course, just to add a little color to this imagery. These are all praying mantids from Mozambique. Does anybody know what that could be? That's a subterranean frog from Central America. They call it uo, and it's sacred for some reason. This is an ant. This is a fly. So these organisms are really, really gorgeous, and this type of portraiture helps you relate to them a little more. It helps if an animal has eyes. It's more difficult if they don't have eyes, but at least this one has some nice colors and spines. So enlarging the subjects, making them bigger, is a very powerful and useful technique, trying to show them to viewers. But what I prefer to do, rather than enlarging my subjects, I'm trying to shrink the viewer. And for that reason, I really, really like a wide-angle technique. The wide-angle technique makes you always feel like you are in the scene. It's like when I look at photos like this, I feel like I'm standing right next to this frog and I am about its size, which I am. But the wide-angle technique also gives you the context of the environment. And I really, really like it because that also shows, in certain ways, the role that this organism plays. You don't know if it's 2 inches long or 2 feet long, but you see that it belongs there. This cricket is about the size of a golf ball, but it's still small by the traditional standards of wildlife. I mean, how different is it from a photo of an antelope in the savannah? They live in exactly the same habitat, but you never see them in stories about the natural history of Africa. So I'm trying to show them as equal members of ecosystem. You can even do it with ants, which, by the way, have much more interesting biology than most mammals. I mean, isn't it a spectacular animal? I mean, doesn't this thing look like Yoda from Star Wars? I mean, seriously. Anyway, so once I have a viewer's attention and appreciation for what the animal looks like, then I can start telling stories about it, because that's what really matters. In order to truly relate to an organism, you have to know something about it, not just that it's pretty, but also what it does. And it really helps to be a biologist to do that, because I study these animals, I sometimes can discover new things that people don't know about. One of the groups that I specialize in is katydids. Can you see the katydid in this photo? There's this big leaf right here. That's a katydid. It's not dead. It's playing dead. Many katydids are perfect mimics of vegetation, of either dry leaves or living leaves. Some of them are just absolutely remarkable. They carry fake fungal damage, and they look like if something took a bite out of them. They're just absolutely perfect mimics. They are almost impossible to find during the day. And so when I ran across this katydid, I was thrilled. This is a katydid known as the peacock katydid. It lives in northern part of South America, and it was the first one I ever ran across, and I was excited. And I, of course, knew what it was, and I knew it was completely harmless. But when I approached it, and it did this, I fell back on my butt because I was so scared. Because it's a startle display. They have this, trick up their sleeve that they employ when they are threatened by a predator. And it's very effective. Even though I knew what it was, I was still scared. So a lot of small organisms employ this kind of language of colors to tell you something. Many organisms, many insects are very brightly colored. And every time you see something that is beautiful, colorful, that has what's called the aposematic coloration, or warning coloration, beauty means deadly, essentially. If something is colorful, that means it's not edible or it can hurt you. These grasshoppers, for example, feed on plants that are very rich in secondary compounds, and their body is loaded with toxins, particularly one kind which is called the cardiac glycoside. So if you eat it, your heart will literally stop. And unfortunately, because these animals look like candy, kids in southern Africa sometimes eat them, and unfortunately either die or get very, very, very sick. So when you see something that's beautiful, stay away. But there's one more problem when showing imagery of organisms and talking about them. And I'll tell you what it is in a second. But I want to introduce this group of animals. They're called the bloodtodians. And this is one of my favorite group of animals. They are beautiful. They play very important ecological roles. Many of them are pollinators. They are removers of detritus. They are cleaners. But I like them, and they're also ancient. They are literally older than dinosaurs. And I like them because they have fascinating parental behavior. They have some of the most complex parental behaviors in the animal kingdom. This is a species that I photographed in Cambodia. It looks like a little pill bug, and it behaves in a very similar way. But it's remarkable because this is an insect that has mammary glands, and it suckles its young, just like mammals. There are other bloodtodians that have a placenta, just like mammals. Most of them have very complex, interesting social structures. They live in family groups. Some of them have small societies with overlapping generations. It's a really remarkable example of parallel evolution of social behavior and complex parental behavior. And just for that reason, they should be worshipped. They're also beautiful, right? Now, you know these insects. You know them. You know them under a slightly different name, that of cockroaches. But of course, I cannot say it at the beginning of the story because that would color your perception of these animals. So, for that reason, I have embarked on this mission to rebrand some of the most disliked smaller organisms. Well, let's take mosquitoes. We hate them, right? Because they're all evil. No, they're not. They're not. There's a handful of species that are quite serious pests and transmitters of diseases, but not all of them, and we have to remember that. This is a mosquito that not only does not feed on blood, it's a pollinator, it feeds on nectar, and its larvae feed on larvae of other mosquitoes, and they particularly target those that transmit yellow fever and dengue fever. They are incredibly beneficial, but nobody knows about them. So again, that's why I chose this photo to be one of the photos in the trees exhibit to attract your attention to the good mosquito. It's a good mosquito. Not all mosquitoes are evil. Okay, here's a real test to see if I can change your mind about something. Here's a rat crawling with parasites. Disgusting, isn't it, right? Well, hopefully I can change your mind. This is a rat that lives in Mozambique. It's a big rat. It's about this big. And in Mozambique, it's called something slightly different. They don't call them just rats. They call them hero rats. Why? These are very highly intelligent animals that can be trained. They also have remarkably good sense of smell. Now, I already mentioned that Mozambique has gone through a horrible 20-year-long civil war that left the country devastated and full of unexploded mines, landmines, that were killing hundreds of people. So somebody came up with an idea to train these rats, because they have such great keen sense of smell, to detect the mines. So there's an organization called Apopo, and what they do, they take these rats in the field, they are trained to sniff out for bombs, and when they find one, they alert their handler, they get a little reward, and the mine personnel comes and disarms the mine. And thanks to these rats, Mozambique is virtually free of mines. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were saved. And there's more. Because they have such a keen sense of smell, they are now being employed to detect early onset of tuberculosis in people. They can sniff out TB faster than any medical test can do it, so that people can be treated before the onset of actual symptoms. Rats. Now, what about those ugly parasites? They're earwigs. They're earwigs, and they are not parasites. They are what zoologists would call epizoic animals. These are animals that live on other animals, but they cause no harm. In fact, what they do, they kill the actual parasites, they remove any dirt or mold from the skin of the rat, and they eat dead flakes of skin. So they are actually living, breathing exfoliants. So that's why the rats love them. It's a beautiful example of truly symbiotic, mutualistic relationship. Yeah? Think about it. So that's one of the things I really like about working on these smaller things, that you discover these layers of relationships. And here's another example of an organism that shows how complex nature is, and I like to call it the fractal nature of nature. Once you start digging in, you will discover new layers of things. So this is a beetle that lives in South America. It's called the harlequin beetle, and it can only be found on this one particular species of a fig tree. And so when I found one, I was excited, not so much about the beetle, but what I will find on the beetle. Because if you start zooming in, you'll realize that on this beetle you find these little things. They're called pseudoscorpions, and they only live on the beetle. Again, they don't harm the beetle. They only use it as essentially a vehicle to move from place to place and find mates. It's like a love boat, literally. It's only the males who live on it, and they fly with the beetle from tree to tree looking for females. But they have to eat something. So what they do, they feed on tiny microscopic mites that also live on the beetle, thus helping, the beetle stay healthy and not be completely parasitized. What it also shows me, this relationship, is that losing a single species means so much more than losing just a single species. It usually means a cascading reaction of extinction. If we lose this one species of a fig growing in this rainforest, we'll lose the beetle, we'll lose the pseudoscorpion, we'll lose the mites. And there are also bacteria and other things living in the mite. And that's why habitat protection is probably the most effective way of getting the most bang for your buck in terms of conservation. And that's why protecting places like Gorongosa National Park is so incredibly effective. But I just want to go back one more time to this complexity and fractal nature of nature. At some point, I realized that I don't really know what lives around my house. And so I started documenting it photographically. And one of the first things I noticed were these giant caterpillars eating my wife's tomatoes. And then the thing that was really interesting is that on those caterpillars were those tiny little parasitic flies, which I find absolutely fascinating. I also realized that I don't really know what comes to my windows, what comes to my lights. This is a photo that I take every year on Thanksgiving, because on Thanksgiving, these moths come to my lights, like on the clock. On Thanksgiving Day, they start showing up, and I never knew what they were. Only later I started paying attention, and I realized it's a very interesting species of moth where only the males fly, and the females are completely flightless. I didn't even know they existed. So it was a kind of interesting discovery, and that kind of prompted me to go deeper and start looking for things actively around my house. I, for example, discovered I have 2 species of praying mantids in my garden. I had no idea. And then I realized, okay, well, what lives around my house is cool, but what does really live inside of my house? And then again, it struck me how fractal nature is, that in my living room, I'm getting the same types of interactions, the same types of guilds of animals as I would see in an African savanna, for example. I have, scavengers, and I have predators that eat those scavengers. One other thing that really struck me was the realization that our homes are caves inhabited by large mammals. We think that we are so separate from nature, that our houses are these pinnacles of our social evolution. But what we are actually doing, we are replicating the environment from which we originally came from those caves, 500,000 years ago. And with that, it's not surprising that animals that originally lived in caves are coming with us. I have 2 species of cave crickets in my house. These are the same crickets that lived in the Mediterranean region of Europe, where early cavemen lived. I have centipedes that come from the Mediterranean region of Europe. These are cave centipedes, and I'm sure many of you also have them in your house. To me, that's absolutely fascinating, that we are subconsciously recreating the environment from which we came originally, and bringing all those animals that shared that environment with us to those new modern caves. By the way, if you don't like those, I'm sure you're familiar with them. They run very fast, they kind of look scary, but they are truly beneficial. First of all, they're completely harmless. They cannot bite you. They cannot bite you, but they feed on all those things that actually can cause some damage. So they'll feed on moths that eat your clothing. They feed on beetles that get into your pantry and eat flour and other things. So these are good neighbors. They're good roommates. They pay their rent and they keep the house clean. So appreciate those centipedes. So let's go back to Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. So when we started the restoration project, the project started about 10 years ago, and I have to say it has been widely successful. We have been able to bring back most of the large animals that originally lived there. In the 1960s and 70s, Gorongosa was probably the largest national park in Africa in terms of the numbers of animals. We had more animals than Serengeti or Kruger National Park. But just to give you an example of what happened during the war, out of 14,000 African buffalo that we originally had, after the war we had about 20, maybe. Out of, I believe, 3,000 zebra, we had 4. So it was a total devastation. Luckily, the habitat itself was left intact, so it was fairly easy to bring the animals back. And in those last 10 years, we have made an incredible progress. For example, one of the species of antelope that was almost completely decimated was the waterbuck that I showed you at the very beginning of this presentation. After the war, there were, I think, about 300 left. Now we have 34,000 in 10 years. A similar progress can be seen in things like the sable antelope. Elephants are coming back. Lions are coming back. Lion, which is the symbol of the park. We are now up to, I believe, about 100 individuals, and before the war there were 200. After the war there were maybe 5. So they are coming back. So we're putting a lot of effort in bringing these animals back, but at the same time we are also paying a lot of attention to the smaller organisms. So we pay attention to lions, and we talk about lions, but in our PR campaigns about the park, we also put a lot of emphasis on these smaller things. We talk about tiger beetles and other smaller organisms. When we monitor the health of the animal population in the park, these are, by the way, just vets checking the health of this buffalo. It's been only sedated, it's fine. We monitor their health, but we also monitor the health of our ant population. Every year we do surveys where we look at the numbers of species, sizes of their populations. We document everything very, very carefully. I already mentioned the problem with poaching. Poaching is a major, major problem in the park, and that's why we employ about 140 rangers that constantly patrol the park, looking for snares, looking for gin traps. But we also pay attention to smaller things. For example, recently we discovered that we had poachers poaching these lizards. It's a critically endangered lizard. This is that smog that I showed you at the very beginning. It's known only from this one population in the park. And that's why I was absolutely shocked when one day I walked into a local pet store and I saw them for sale. We were able to track back how they got there, and we were able to find the person who illegally collected them in the park. But that's also a problem that we have to deal with, actual poaching of smaller animals. So we are paying attention to small things. We are also paying attention to the non-charismatic things. Gorongosa is one of the best places to see African birds. We have over 400 species. If you like birds, come to Gorongosa. We have endemic orioles. We have endemic sunbirds. We have beautiful weaver birds. So come and see them. But what you should really come to see are our vultures. We have 5 species of vultures. They may not be pretty, but they are far more important than those other birds. And they are also highly threatened. Of all 5 species are on the red list, on the IUCN red list, listed as either threatened or endangered. And our population is really doing really well. So come and appreciate those birds. So, as you can see, I care about those little things, but it's very difficult to get support for that type of work. Recently, we started a project where we are documenting and trying to protect our bat population. Bat are kind of, I would consider them honorary insects. And unfortunately, with that also comes the stigma of being sort of like an insect, and people generally don't like bats. But a lot of them need our help. We have several species that are highly threatened. And we are trying, really trying to save them as much as we are trying to save these bigger animals. So, again, I will consider my work done if I can find as many donors or people appreciating the fact that we are saving these bats as we are finding now for lions and other things. And I will be particularly happy if I can find people who care not only about the bat, look at that thing on its head, but also about the parasitic flies on the bats. Because if we lose the bat, we also lose this animal. Again, it may not be pretty, but it has exactly the same right to live as you and I and everything else on the planet. And with that, I'll thank you.